Imagine opening your eyes one morning and realizing that your body is not truly your own, that every trembling hand, every labored breath, every crooked bone is not the result of fate or divine punishment, but of choices made long before you were born. Your ancestors, obsessed with the illusion of purity, have chained you to a destiny of suffering. In this world, bloodlines are prisons, and the walls are built not of stone, but of genealogy. This is not the premise of a Gothic novel or a dark fairy tale. It was the lived reality of countless men and women born into Europe's most powerful dynasties. For centuries, European royals convinced themselves that their blood was not just noble, but sacred, different, superior, blessed by God Himself. To dilute it with that of commoners was unthinkable. To preserve it meant power. And so, cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, sometimes even aunts married nephews, until the family trees of Europe looked less like branching oaks and more like suffocating vines, coiling back upon themselves. The Habsburg dynasty of Austria and Spain turned this obsession into an art form. Their unofficial motto could have been, "Let others wage wars, you, happy Austria, marry." But these marriages brought little happiness. Behind gilded palace doors and under vaulted cathedral ceilings, the results were catastrophic. Generations of children born not with the strength of empires, but with the frailty of a collapsing bloodline. Our first story begins in Vienna in the winter of 1634, when the corridors of the Hofburg Palace echoed not with the laughter of celebration, but with whispers of dread. A child had been born, a princess of Austria, who would never know a single day free from pain. Her name was Maria Anna of Austria. From the very beginning, Maria Anna's body betrayed her. Her spine twisted into a cruel curve that forced her into a hunched posture. Breathing was a struggle, walking nearly impossible. Her jaw jutted forward so sharply that chewing solid food was agonizing. Servants cut her meals into tiny fragments, and even then, each bite required slow, deliberate effort, as though her very act of eating was a battle against her own body. What haunted her most was not just the pain, but the mirror of history staring back at her. The palace walls were covered with portraits of her ancestors, great dukes, kings, and queens. But for Maria Anna, these oil-painted faces were not symbols of glory. They were grim reminders. An uncle with the same protruding jaw, a grandmother with the same hunched back. She saw herself in them, and she understood, even as a child, that she was not unique. She was merely the next chapter in a book written by generations of incestuous unions. Physicians came regularly, their robes heavy with the scent of herbs, their hands stained with ink from their endless notes. They measured the angle of her spine, examined her teeth, prodded her frail limbs. To them, Maria Anna was not a daughter of emperors, but a medical specimen, living proof of what inbreeding could do. In their records, she became a list of symptoms rather than a young woman with a mind as sharp as her body was broken. Yet despite her fragile body, Maria Anna possessed a brilliant mind. She devoured books in multiple languages, escaping into worlds where marriage was a choice, where children were born of love, not obligation. In stories of ancient Rome and distant lands, she found freedom that reality denied her. But no book could silence the whispers in the palace corridors. Whispers that spoke of the Habsburg curse, a phrase never uttered in her presence, but well known to everyone around her. Marriage, the expected duty of every royal woman, was denied to her. Even in a world where cousin marriage was normal, Maria Anna's condition was too severe, her deformities too obvious. Suitors recoiled, negotiations ended as quickly as they began. Her fate was sealed not by scandal or politics, but by biology. She would remain unwed, a princess without a kingdom of her own, a daughter of emperors destined for loneliness. She died at just 32 years old, her body succumbing to the accumulated damage of her cursed inheritance. The death record cited various ailments, but it did not name the true cause. How could it? To write the truth would have been to indict her parents, her grandparents, and centuries of royal policy. The truth was this: Maria Anna died not from fever or frailty, but from a family's relentless pursuit of purity. Her story was only the beginning. From Austria to Spain, from France to the far corners of Europe, generations of women would pay the price for a political experiment that valued lineage over love, power over compassion. Theirs were lives of suffering, whispered about in palace chambers, but rarely acknowledged in the history books. Yet to understand the tragedy of these women, we must continue our journey to a queen whose grief was so raw, so unrelenting, that history branded her as mad. From the hushed corridors of Vienna, our journey turns to Spain, where the tragedy of inbreeding took a more visible and far more infamous form. Here, in the royal courts of Castile, one woman's suffering would echo across centuries, not merely as a tale of genetic frailty, but as a cautionary story about love, power, and betrayal. Her name was Joanna of Castile, remembered by history as Juana la Loca Joanna, the Mad. Born in 1479, Joanna entered the world at a time when Spain itself was being reborn. Her parents, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, were hailed as the Catholic monarchs. They expelled Jews and Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, united two kingdoms, and sent Columbus across the Atlantic to claim a new world. Their dynasty stood at the very center of Europe's rising power. For their daughter Joanna, this meant destiny. She was never meant to be merely a woman. She was to be a political bond, a living chess piece in the great game of European power. As a child, Joanna showed brilliance. She was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and skilled in music and philosophy. Accounts from tutors and ambassadors describe her as intense, passionate, and unusually thoughtful for a princess. Yet beneath that intelligence lay something more fragile: the silent inheritance of Habsburg blood. Her parents were themselves cousins, another link in the ever-tightening web of European dynastic inbreeding. Her fate was sealed when she was married off to Philip of Burgundy, known as Philip the Handsome. To Spain, it was a triumph in alliance with the powerful Habsburg lands in the Low Countries. To Joanna, it was a beginning of torment. Philip was indeed handsome, but also arrogant, manipulative, and faithless. He treated his young wife not with affection, but with cold indifference punctuated by cruelty. For a woman raised to believe that marriage was her sacred duty and producing heirs her ultimate purpose, Philip's rejection struck like a dagger. Joanna's response was not mild or submissive. She clung to him with a desperate, obsessive intensity. When he strayed with other women, as he often did, she confronted him with rage, jealousy, and tears. To her courtiers, her passion seemed excessive, even unnatural. They whispered that she was unstable, that her love was not love, but madness. But was it truly madness? Or was it the natural cry of a woman trapped in a loveless marriage, humiliated in public, and stripped of any power to change her fate? The breaking point came in 1506. Philip, still young, died suddenly. Some said from fever, others whispered from poison. For Joanna, the loss was unbearable. Her grief was not a quiet mourning, but a wild, unrelenting obsession. She refused to bury him. Instead, she traveled across Spain with his coffin, opening it again and again to gaze at his decaying face, to touch him, to kiss the body that had once scorned her. The image horrified her contemporaries, but beneath the horror lay something profoundly human. Joanna had lost the only person who had ever commanded her heart. however cruelly. She could not let him go. It was then that her family seized its chance. Her father, Ferdinand, declared her mad and locked her away, keeping the crown of Castile for himself. Later, her son Charles, who would become the mighty Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, continued her imprisonment. For 46 years, Joanna lived in confinement at the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The conditions were abysmal. She was shut in cold, damp chambers, denied light, denied proper food, denied dignity. Attendants reported that she sometimes tore her clothes to rags, that she screamed for hours, that she refused to bathe for weeks. To the world outside, she was the Mad Queen, a cautionary tale of feminine weakness, but modern historians see her differently. Yes, Joanna may have suffered from depression, anxiety, or what today we might call post-traumatic stress disorder. The Habsburg bloodline carried patterns of mental illness, worsened by inbreeding. Yet much of her madness was political fiction. She was an inconvenient queen, one who stood between powerful men and their ambitions. Declaring her insane was the easiest way to erase her. Her story, then, is not just about a woman broken by genetics, but about a woman broken by politics. She was silenced not because she was incapable of ruling, but because she was too inconvenient to be allowed to rule. When Joanna finally died in 1555, she had been forgotten by the world. Her death was barely marked, her memory reduced to a cruel nickname, but behind that name was a truth more tragic and more profound. Joanna was not merely a victim of madness. She was a victim of a dynasty that demanded obedience, of a family that treated her as an obstacle, of a bloodline that handed her both brilliance and despair. Her life asks us a haunting question: how much of her suffering was born from the twisted genes of her ancestors, and how much from the twisted ambitions of men who found it easier to call her insane than to acknowledge her humanity? From Spain, the story returns to Vienna, where the cycle of sacrifice and suffering continued. This time, the victim was not a queen locked away for decades, but a little girl promised in marriage before she could even speak, a child who would grow into a bride before her body was ready. If Joanna of Castile showed us the psychological torment of a queen erased by politics, our next stories plunge us deeper into the physical cost of dynastic ambition. They reveal how little girls were treated not as daughters, but as pawns traded, promised, and wed long before they understood what marriage even meant. In 1651, within the golden halls of Madrid's Alcazar Palace, a child was born who carried the full weight of Spain's empire on her fragile shoulders. Margaret Teresa of Spain. She was the daughter of Philip IV and his niece, Mariana of Austria. Yes, his niece. By this point, the Habsburg dynasty had folded so tightly in on itself that even uncles marrying their brothers' daughters was not considered unusual. In fact, it was celebrated as a way to strengthen the bloodline. Margaret Teresa's childhood is one of the most well-documented in royal history, immortalized by the great painter Diego Velázquez. In masterpieces like Las Meninas, we see her in elaborate gowns, her hair adorned with ribbons, her small body swallowed by the trappings of royalty. Yet if you look closely beyond the brushstrokes of elegance, you see signs of fragility. Her jaw, slightly protruding, her posture, not quite straight, her gaze, distant, almost vacant. They were hints of the Habsburg inheritance that no artist, no matter how gifted, could disguise completely. From birth, Margaret Teresa's future was already written. At just a toddler's age, she was betrothed to her uncle, Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor. For European diplomats, this was a brilliant alliance. For the little girl herself, it was a life sentence. Every lesson she received, music, languages, courtly dance, was framed not as a pursuit of knowledge, but as preparation to make her a more suitable bride to her uncle. At 15, Margaret Theresa was married off. The grand celebrations that accompanied the wedding could not mask the grim reality. She was a child expected to fulfill the duties of a wife and mother. Almost immediately, the pressure to bear children began. The continuation of the Habsburg line, already weakened by generations of inbreeding, depended on her body. The pregnancies came quickly, and with them, tragedy. Her first daughter died in infancy. A second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Another child survived only a few months. When at last she bore a son who lived, relief spread across the empire. But the boy himself was frail, sickly, already showing the marks of genetic weakness. For Margaret Theresa, the joy of motherhood was always shadowed by the dread of loss. Each pregnancy drained her. Modern doctors, reading the court physician's notes, suspect she suffered from severe anemia, respiratory illness, and perhaps epilepsy. Her body, already weakened by the Habsburg curse, simply could not withstand the constant strain. By 1673, barely 6 years after her marriage, Margaret Theresa was dead. She was just 21 years old. The official cause? Fever. The real cause? Generations of choices that sacrificed her life for the illusion of bloodline purity. But Margaret Theresa was not the only child sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. Another young girl, Anna of Austria, faced her own lifelong torment. Born in 1601, she was yet another product of an uncle-niece union. At 14, she was married to Louis XIII of France in a grand alliance meant to end decades of warfare between Spain and France. For Anna, the shift was brutal. She was torn from Madrid and thrust into the alien world of Versailles, where everything, the language, the customs, the very rhythm of life, was foreign. Louis XIII, a man of icy temperament, showed her little affection. Their marriage was not a partnership, but a contract, and Anna bore the loneliness of it in silence. Her greatest burden was the expectation to bear heirs, yet like so many Habsburg women, she struggled. Her first pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. With each failure, the blame fell not on the king, but on her. Physicians subjected her to humiliating examinations, bizarre treatments, and punishing regimens of bloodletting and purging. They whispered that she was cursed, that God had closed her womb, that perhaps France needed another queen. The strain broke her spirit. Anna withdrew from court life, developing what we might now recognize as severe anxiety and depression. She turned to religion, spending hours in obsessive prayer, clinging to ritual as her only source of comfort. Then, after 23 years of marriage, the miracle came. Against all odds, Anna gave birth to a healthy son, Louis XIV, the future Sun King. France rejoiced, declaring it an act of divine providence. But for Anna, the miracle was double-edged. She had fulfilled her role at last, but the decades of humiliation and despair had left scars that never faded. Even in her later years, after producing a second son and securing the dynasty, she remained fragile, anxious, plagued by illness. Margaret Theresa and Anna of Austria, two women separated by a generation but united by blood, embodied the same cruel truth. Their worth was measured only by their ability to reproduce. They were daughters, wives, mothers, but never individuals. Their suffering was hidden behind the grandeur of royal ceremony, their personal tragedies erased in the triumphal language of dynastic survival. And yet, the cost was mounting. Each generation of Habsburg unions compounded the damage. Each child bride, each fragile mother, pushed the dynasty closer to collapse. Their stories set the stage for perhaps the most famous victim of all, a young Austrian princess whose name would become synonymous with both extravagance and downfall. By the mid-18th century, The Habsburg dynasty had ruled for centuries, its bloodline so tangled that nearly every royal portrait bore the same familiar jawline. Yet Europe was changing. New ideas about liberty and equality were stirring, even as the old world of dynastic marriage pressed on unchanged. Into this world was born a young girl destined to become one of history's most infamous queens, Marie Antoinette. She entered the world in 1755, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. Though this union was less tightly consanguineous than earlier Habsburg pairings, the weight of generations of inbreeding still coursed through her veins. From her earliest portraits, painted by court artists eager to flatter, we see her youthful beauty, but also subtle hints of that unmistakable Habsburg inheritance, the slightly protruding lip, the softened yet distinct jaw. To most observers, she was dazzling. To historians today, she was a fragile branch on a decaying family tree. At 14, she was married off to the Dauphin of France, the future Louis XVI, in a union meant to bind Austria and France after generations of enmity. The pomp of her arrival in Versailles could not disguise the reality. Marie Antoinette was a child bride, a foreigner in one of the most demanding courts in Europe, carrying the hopes of two empires on her delicate shoulders. The marriage from the start was troubled. Versailles was a place of suspicion and gossip, where every glance and every gesture became political currency. Marie Antoinette struggled to adapt. Louis XVI, shy and awkward, proved incapable of intimacy for years. Court whispers began almost immediately. Was it her fault? Was the Austrian princess barren? Physicians examined her, probing for female defects. They did not understand that Louis himself likely suffered from developmental and physical difficulties, possibly tied to his own lineage. But in a court where women bore the blame, Marie Antoinette became the target. 7 years passed before the marriage was consummated. By then, rumors had spread like wildfire. Pamphlets circulated mocking her as cold, frigid, perhaps even unnatural. Every failed pregnancy, every miscarriage, every delay in producing an heir was magnified into scandal. For Marie, the pressure was suffocating. She suffered from what modern doctors might recognize as hormonal imbalances, anxiety, and depression, all conditions amplified by the genetic fragility inherited from her ancestors. When she finally bore children, the relief was immense. Her first daughter, Marie-Thérèse, survived infancy, but subsequent pregnancies brought tragedy. Miscarriages, infant deaths, long stretches of illness haunted her motherhood. Behind the diamonds and silks, she was a grieving mother, a fragile woman raking beneath relentless scrutiny. But the greatest tragedy was not her body, it was timing. France was collapsing. The old order was crumbling under economic crisis, famine, and revolutionary fervor. In this volatile moment, Marie Antoinette's personal struggles became political weapons. Her anxiety, her impulsive spending, her retreat into luxury signs, perhaps of psychological fragility, were twisted into symbols of arrogance. "Let them eat cake," the phrase she likely never uttered, became her epitaph in popular memory. As the revolution gathered force, she displayed both courage and despair. Witnesses describe her swinging between bursts of manic determination and deep melancholy, mirroring the instability that had plagued Habsburg women for centuries. Was she simply a queen under impossible pressure, or was she also carrying the genetic legacy of depression and mood disorders that had haunted her bloodline? History cannot say for certain. When the monarchy fell, Marie Antoinette was imprisoned, stripped of her titles, and paraded before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The woman once painted in silk gowns by Elisabeth Vigée. Lebrun now appeared pale, frail, her hair turned white from stress. In prison, guards reported moments of confusion, lapses of focus, and long spells of silent symptoms we might today call dissociation, common in trauma victims. Yet in her final moments, she showed a dignity that even her enemies could not erase. On October 16, 1793, she was led to the guillotine. She apologized to her executioner after accidentally stepping on his foot, a final act of courtesy from a woman condemned as a monster. Then, before the eyes of the crowd, the blade fell, ending not just her life, but symbolically severing centuries of dynastic rule. Her death was not only the downfall of a queen, it was the last gasp of a family line that had destroyed itself from within. For centuries, the Habsburgs believed they could preserve their greatness through purity of blood. Instead, that purity became poison. Marie Antoinette was both the victim and the symbol of this tragedy, her beauty and youth consumed by the weight of ancestral choices she never made. But the story does not end with her, for the Habsburg experiment in inbreeding had one more, final act, a king so genetically compromised that he became a living symbol of the dynasty's collapse. To understand the full cost of this obsession, we must turn to Spain, where the last male Habsburg, Charles II, would embody the dynasty's final curse. If Marie Antoinette's execution marked the symbolic fall of dynastic arrogance, the true biological collapse of the Habsburg line had already unfolded in Spain. There, the last king of the Spanish Habsburgs, Charles II, became the living embodiment of centuries of inbreeding, a man whose very body and mind bore the accumulated weight of a dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity. Born in 1661, Charles came into the world sickly, frail, and already carrying the visible markers of his ancestry. His jaw jutted forward grotesquely, a severe exaggeration of the infamous Habsburg jaw. He could barely chew his food. His tongue was so large that he struggled to speak clearly, earning ridicule even within his own court. Walking was difficult, his body bent and awkward. Illnesses plagued him constantly: fevers, seizures, stomach ailments. By modern analysis, his genetic inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of the child of siblings. He was, in many ways, the genetic dead end of a family tree that had looped in on itself for 16 generations. But Charles was not only a medical case, he was also a king, and a tragic one. Spain at the time was an empire in decline, exhausted by wars, drained by colonial mismanagement, its people starving. The hope of the realm rested on Charles, but he could not carry the weight. He was infertile, unable to produce an heir despite 2 marriages. To his subjects, this infertility was not a medical reality, but a divine punishment. Rumors spread that he was bewitched, cursed by sorcery. His enemies called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Inside the Alcazar palace, life resembled less a royal court than a hospital ward. Physicians crowded around the king daily, prescribing endless treatments, bleeding, purging, charms, prayers. Yet nothing could cure him. His reign became a theater of suffering, his body a stage upon which the consequences of centuries of incest played out before the eyes of the world. Nor was Charles alone in his misery. His sisters and female cousins, the Spanish infantas, suffered their own cruel fates. Records describe young princesses who could not walk until late childhood, who spoke with slurred words, who experienced seizures and developmental delays. Some were married off anyway, sent into unions with other relatives, their frail bodies forced into pregnancies that almost always ended in miscarriage or infant death. The Alcazar became a mausoleum of lost children, a place where cradle after cradle stood empty. The science we know today, recessive genes, inbreeding depression, hereditary illness, was centuries away. But even then, the pattern was clear. Courtiers whispered of the Habsburg curse. Physicians documented deformities in detail. The Catholic Church, which could have intervened by refusing marriage dispensations, instead sanctioned them. Politics triumphed over biology again and again until the inevitable collapse. That collapse came in 1700, when Charles II died at just 39. His body was so wasted that an autopsy report, later circulated, claimed his intestines were rotten, his lungs corroded, his heart shriveled, the size of a peppercorn. He left no heir. With him, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty ended, and Europe was thrown into the bloody war of the Spanish succession, as rival powers fought to inherit the spoils of an empire that had devoured its own future. And yet, from this devastation, something unexpected emerged: knowledge. The tragedies of the Habsburgs became a living laboratory for later scientists and historians. Their portraits, medical notes, and genealogies provided some of the earliest case studies of the effects of inbreeding. From their suffering came insights into genetic inheritance, recessive traits, and the importance of diversity for human survival. But to speak only of science risks erasing what matters most: the humanity of those who lived and died under this curse. Maria Anna of Austria, who sought escape in books when her body failed her. Joanna of Castile, who clung to the corpse of her beloved, her grief twisted into madness by others. Margaret Teresa, dead at 21, after her body was used like a vessel. Anna of Austria, humiliated for decades before producing an heir. Marie Antoinette, destroyed by politics and memory. Charles II, mocked as bewitched, but really just a man born into an impossible genetic prison. They were not symbols. They were not mere case studies. They were human beings' daughters, sons, mothers, as each deserving of a life unburdened by the choices of their ancestors. And yet, their stories were shaped not by love, but by strategy, not by freedom, but by compulsion. The lesson of their suffering reaches beyond palaces and crowns. It reminds us of the dangers of reducing human beings to tools, whether for politics, tradition, or ideology. The Habsburgs believed their blood made them divine. Instead, it revealed their fragility. The true nobility was not in their lineage, but in the resilience with which these individuals endured lives of pain, isolation, and betrayals. As we close this journey, return once more to that haunting thought. Waking up and realizing your destiny was written centuries before your birth. For the Habsburgs, this was no thought experiment, it was reality. They lived with bodies twisted by ancestry, minds haunted by grief, spirits crushed by expectation. Yet even in their despair, they left behind a message for us. That message is simple but profound. Power built on suffering is doomed. Bloodline purity is a myth. True legacy lies not in ancestry, but in humanity.